The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and stronger coffee than Talia Monroe-Hart had any business drinking at 9 in the morning. But she drank it anyway, because her hands needed something to do besides shake. Across the mahogany table, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Cedar, something citrus underneath, expensive in a way that made her want to roll her eyes. Sat Choi Seo-jun, arms crossed over a suit that probably cost more than her restaurant's monthly gas bill. He hadn't looked at her once since she'd walked in. Not once, which was fine. She hadn't wanted him to. Mr. Choi. Ms. Monroe-Hart. The lawyer, a thin, silver-haired man named Elliot Pierce who'd represented both families for longer than either of them had been alive, folded his hands on top of a folder thick enough to be a phone book. I want to start by saying I take no pleasure in this. Then don't read it, Talia said. Whatever it is. Talia. Her grandmother's voice, low and warning, from the seat beside her. Miss Odessa Monroe-Hart, 78 years old and sharp enough to cut glass, had raised her granddaughter to run a restaurant and to know when to hush, and clearly this was one of those second moments. Seo-jun's grandfather, a broad, silver-templed man named Choi Yong-tae who ran the largest Korean barbecue chain on the eastern seaboard, cleared his throat. Read it, Elliot. Pierce opened the folder. As you both know, the property at the corner of Ashby and Fern, currently home to Hart's Table on one side and Choi Garden Barbecue on the other, sharing a parking structure, a load-in alley, and, as of 18 months ago, a lawsuit over encroachment on that shared alley that has cost both families in excess of $200,000 combined, was originally purchased as a single parcel in 1974 by Odessa's late husband, Thomas Monroe-Hart, and Yong-tae's late business partner, Choi Duk-hwan. Talia already knew this part. Her grandfather and Seo-jun's honorary grandfather, not blood but as close as it got in that generation, had bought the land together back when a black man and a Korean immigrant buying commercial property together in this city was its own kind of quiet revolution. They'd split it down the middle with a handshake and, apparently, no actual legal partition, which was the entire reason two grown adults were sitting in a lawyer's office right now instead of running their restaurants. The original deed, Pierce continued, contains a reversion clause neither family knew existed until my associate found it during discovery. It states that if the parcel is ever the subject of formal litigation between the two founding families, ownership of the entire property, both buildings, passes to a joint trust, dissolvable only by, and I'm quoting directly here, the union of the founding families by marriage, blood, or binding partnership at the discretion of the surviving elders. Silence. Talia set her coffee cup down very carefully, because if she didn't, she was going to throw it. I'm sorry. Say that again. Your grandfather and Mr. Choi's partner built in a clause, Pierce said, not unkindly, that if their families ever ended up suing each other over that land, the only way to get it back was for the families to be joined. Marriage was one option they wrote in. That's insane, Talia said. Nobody does that. That's not a real legal document. That's a fairy tale a bunch of old men wrote when they were drunk. It's notarized, witnessed, and it's been sitting in a filing cabinet for 52 years, Pierce said. It's real. Seo-jun spoke for the first time since she'd walked in, and his voice was flatter than she expected, like he'd already burned through his anger somewhere private and had nothing left but exhaustion. So the lawsuit my grandfather filed triggered the clause, Pierce said. Yes. I told you not to file it, Seo-jun said to his grandfather, and there it was, the first crack in that composed, lacquered surface. I told you we could settle the alley dispute without lawyers. Yong-tae didn't flinch. Your father would have filed it too. My father's dead, Seo-jun said, and something moved behind Talia's ribs at that. An unwelcome pinprick of sympathy she didn't have room for right now. So is her grandfather. Doesn't mean we have to keep making their mistakes. It's not a mistake, Odessa said quietly, and everyone turned to her. She had her hands folded in her lap, dignified as ever, but her eyes were wet. Thomas loved that restaurant. He loved that man. She tipped her chin toward Yong-tae. If this is the last thing he left behind for us, I'm not going to spit on it by losing the building to some trust neither of us control. Grandma, Talia's voice cracked. You cannot possibly be saying what I think you're saying. I'm saying, Odessa said, That Hart's Table has fed this neighborhood for 50 years, and I will be damned if it gets sold out from under us to pay lawyers because two men who are already gone can't stop arguing." She reached over and took Talia's hand, and her grip was steel wrapped in soft, papery skin. "You don't have to love him. You don't even have to like him. You just have to marry him long enough to dissolve the trust, and then you can divorce him the day after if you want to." "I don't even know him," Talia said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. "I don't want to know you either," Seo-jun said, and it should have stung, but instead it settled something in her chest, oddly. At least he wasn't pretending. "There it is," she said. "At least we agree on something." Yongtae exhaled, long and slow, like a man who'd been holding his breath for 50 years. "Seo-jun, look at me," his grandson did, jaw tight. "Your father built the company on the idea that we honor what came before us, even when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's inconvenient. This is that. This is insane," Seo-jun said, echoing Talia almost word for word, and for one strange second their eyes actually met across the table. His dark, furious, tired, and something passed between them that wasn't quite understanding but was at least recognition. "You're as trapped as I am." 6 months, Pierce said into the silence. "The trust dissolves automatically 6 months after a legally recognized marriage between the two families, provided the lawsuit is formally withdrawn. After that, you can do whatever you want. Divorce, annulment, live in separate hemispheres. The property reverts to joint private ownership. Split down the original line." 6 months, Talia repeated. 6 months, Seo-jun said, like he was tasting something bitter. Odessa squeezed her hand once more. "Your grandfather used to say the best partnerships nobody chose on purpose. He didn't choose Dukwon either. Circumstances put them next to each other, and look what they built." "Circumstances didn't marry them," Talia muttered. "No," her grandmother agreed. "But baby, sometimes the building outlives the reason you built it. Don't let it burn down because you're too proud to sign a piece of paper." Talia looked across the table at Choi Seo-jun, at his perfect posture, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working, his hands flat on the table like he was bracing for impact, and thought with a kind of grim, hysterical clarity, "I am going to marry a man I have hated on principle for 6 years to save a restaurant, because our dead grandfathers were sentimental fools." "Fine," she said. Seo-jun's head snapped toward her. "Fine, fine," she said again louder, mostly to convince herself. 6 months. "We do it for the restaurants, we do it for them." She nodded at Odessa, then grudgingly at Yongtae. "And then it's done and I never have to see your face again." Something flickered across Seo-jun's face. Surprise, maybe, that she'd said yes before he had. He looked at his grandfather, who was watching him with the quiet, unbearable patience of a man who had already buried a son and did not intend to bury a legacy too. "Fine," Seo-jun said finally, and it sounded like it cost him something. 6 months. Pierce closed the folder. "I'll draft the paperwork. I'd recommend you two spend some time together before the ceremony. For appearances, if nothing else. Reporters have already called my office twice this morning." "Reporters," Talia said flatly. "Choi Garden is a regional chain with 40 locations," Pierce said. "Hart's Table has a James Beard nomination. 2 feuding restaurant families getting married isn't exactly a quiet story." Talia put her head in her hands. Beside her, she heard Seo-jun mutter something in Korean under his breath that she was fairly sure wasn't polite, and despite everything, despite the absurdity, the fury, the sheer aggravating unfairness of it, she almost laughed. Almost. The alley between Hart's Table and Choi Garden Barbecue was 11 feet wide, cracked down the middle where 2 different contractors had poured concrete 40 years apart, and it was, as far as Talia was concerned, the ugliest 11 feet of real estate in the entire city, mostly because for the last 6 years it had been a battleground. Started small. Choi Garden's delivery trucks blocking Hart's Table's load-in during Sunday brunch rush. Hart's Table's grease trap overflowing onto Choi Garden's side during a July heat wave. A shouting match between her Uncle Reggie and Seo-jun's cousin over whose dumpster smell was worse that had ended with both of them threatening to call the health department on the other. Talia had inherited the feud the way she'd inherited the restaurant, without being asked, and without much choice in the matter. She was standing in that alley now, 3 days after the reading of the will, arms crossed, staring at the man she was going to marry as he stood on his side of the crack in the concrete, staring back at her with equal enthusiasm. "This was your grandmother's idea," Seo-jun said. "It wasn't a question. She said if we're going to be photographed together, we should at least know each other's coffee order first." Talia held up 2 cups. "I got you something. I don't know what you like, so I got you the same thing I'm having, which is a peace offering, so don't read into it." He looked at the cup like it might be poisoned. "What is it?" "Chicory coffee, oat milk, little bit of cinnamon. It's good. It's not going to kill you." He took it, sniffed it with the deep suspicion of a man raised around excellent coffee, and took a sip. His eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen on his face since the lawyer's office. He seemed annoyed to admit it. "That's actually good." "I know," Talia said. "I've been drinking coffee longer than you've been alive, probably." "I doubt that. You can't be more than 29, she said. "You, 31. He took another sip, and some of the rigidity went out of his shoulders, just slightly, like the coffee had loosened something. "My grandfather wants us to have dinner. Publicly. Choi Garden. This week." "Absolutely not. I told him you'd say that." "Then why are you asking?" "Because he doesn't listen to me," Seo-jun said, and there was something raw underneath the flat delivery, something that made Talia look at him more closely. "He hasn't listened to me about anything in this business since my father died. I give him a plan, he does the opposite, and somehow it still works out, and somehow that means I'm wrong and he's right, forever, about everything." Talia hadn't expected honesty. She'd expected arrogance, or cold formality, or the kind of practiced charm she imagined rich men used to get their way. Instead, she got a tired man in an expensive coat, standing in a dirty alley, quietly furious at his own grandfather. "My grandmother's the same," she found herself saying. "Except she's not wrong. That's the worst part. She's usually right, and she knows it, and she uses her being right as a weapon." "That does sound worse," Seo-jun admitted. "It is worse." Talia leaned against the brick wall of her own building, careful not to get grease on her chef's coat. "Fine. Dinner. But not at Choi Garden. Neutral ground." "There is no neutral ground. Every restaurant in a 5-block radius is owned by someone who's already picked a side in this feud. Then we go somewhere nobody knows us. Somewhere with bad lighting and worse wine, so if we hate each other by the end of it, at least nobody got a good photo." For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of Seo-jun's mouth. It transformed his whole face, softened the sharp lines of his jaw, put a little warmth in eyes that had, until now, looked carved from stone. "Okay," he said. "Bad lighting. Worse wine. Deal." He held out his hand. She looked at it for a second too long. She hadn't touched him yet, not once, not even a handshake at the lawyer's office, and then she took it. His hand was warm and bigger than hers, and the calluses on his palm surprised her. She'd expected the soft hands of an executive, not the hands of someone who'd worked a grill. "You cook?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "Every Sunday," he said. "My grandfather thinks it's beneath me now that I run operations. I do it anyway." "Huh?" Talia said, and let go of his hand a beat later than strictly necessary. "Didn't expect that." "There's a lot you don't expect about me," Seo-jun said, and it wasn't flirtatious, exactly, more matter-of-fact, almost tired. But it lodged somewhere in her chest anyway, small and unwelcome, like a splinter she'd think about later. "I'm sure," she said, and walked back into her restaurant before she could examine that feeling any further. The dive bar Talia picked was called Fens, tucked 3 blocks off the main strip, lit almost entirely by a buzzing neon Schlitz sign and a scatter of string lights someone had clearly hung a decade ago and never replaced. The wine list had 4 options, all terrible, and the bartender didn't recognize either of them, which was exactly the point. Seo-jun showed up in a plain black sweater instead of a suit, and Talia had to admit, silently and only to herself, that it did something to her that she resented on principle. He looked less like a corporate heir and more like a person. Broad shoulders, dark hair a little mussed like he'd run his hands through it on the drive over. A jaw that was somehow even more distracting without a tie choking it into formality. "You're staring," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "I'm assessing the enemy," Talia said. "Standard procedure." "Am I still the enemy?" "You filed a lawsuit against my grandmother." "My grandfather filed the lawsuit. I told him not to." He signaled the bartender, pointed at whatever red wine Talia was already drinking, held up 2 fingers. "For what it's worth, I've spent the last 18 months trying to keep this whole thing out of court. I lost. That doesn't erase 6 years of your family blocking my loading dock. Your family's grease trap nearly shut down my restaurant for a week. Your cousin called the health department on us out of spite. Your uncle threw a bag of trash onto our side of the alley on camera. It's still on the neighborhood Facebook group. It has 400 comments." Talia opened her mouth to argue and then, unwillingly, laughed. A short, surprised huff of air that she immediately tried to smother. "Okay, that one's fair. Reggie's a menace. My cousin Hannah isn't much better. She once left a 1-star review of your restaurant from 6 different fake accounts. I found the spreadsheet she used to track them." "She had a spreadsheet?" "She's very thorough." The wine arrived. Talia picked hers up, considered it, drank it anyway. It was, as promised, worse than her first glass. "So if neither of us actually started this, then we've been fighting a war neither of us declared, for the amusement of 2 elderly men who apparently think marrying us off is a reasonable solution. When you say it like that, it sounds insane." "It is insane." Seo-jun turned his glass slowly on the scarred wood table. "I looked up your restaurant's history after the will reading. James Beard nomination 3 years running. Featured in 2 magazines. Your grandmother built that from a lunch counter her mother-in-law ran during segregation, when black families in this neighborhood couldn't eat anywhere else nearby." Talia went still. "You did your homework. I wanted to know who I was about to marry. And I think," he said slowly, like he was choosing the words carefully, "that you built something worth protecting, even if I don't particularly enjoy how we ended up sitting across from each other." It wasn't a compliment, exactly. It was something more careful than that, an acknowledgement, maybe, that surprised her more than flattery would have. "Choi Garden's not exactly a mom-and-pop operation either," she said, because she didn't know what to do with the warmth blooming low in her stomach, and deflection was easier than sitting with it. 40 locations. You're basically Korean barbecue's answer to a fast-casual empire. My grandfather started with 1 restaurant and a food truck," Seo-jun said, something proud and defensive flashing in his eyes. "He came here with nothing. Built all of this with his hands and Dukwon's, your grandfather's partner, side by side, in a neighborhood that didn't always want either of them there. I don't apologize for what we built, even if it grew bigger than the original vision." "I didn't ask you to apologize. You implied it." "I implied it a little," Talia admitted, and this time when she smiled, it wasn't strategic. "Fine. Truce. On the history, at least." "Truce on the history," he agreed. They sat in a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable, the neon sign buzzing overhead, and Talia found herself studying him again. Not as an enemy this time, but as a person. The way his hands moved when he talked, precise and controlled. The tiredness around his eyes that no amount of good tailoring could hide. The way he'd ordered the same terrible wine as her without complaint. Like some small part of him wanted to meet her halfway even if the rest of him didn't know how yet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And you don't have to answer. Go ahead. Your dad. What happened?" Something shuddered behind his eyes, quick and total, like a door slamming. For a second she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Heart attack," he said finally. 4 years ago. In the middle of a lease negotiation, actually, which is a very on-brand way for a man who worked himself into the ground to go. I was 27. My grandfather had already semi-retired. I got handed the company with about 6 weeks of preparation, and a grandfather who suddenly decided he wasn't ready to fully let go after all. "I'm sorry," Talia said, and meant it. "Yeah." He exhaled. "You My parents run a second location upstate. My grandmother raised me in the kitchen at Hart's table because my mom was young when she had me and needed help, and somewhere along the way it just became mine. My grandmother's letting me run it, technically. But she still shows up every Tuesday and rearranges my walk-in if she doesn't like how I've organized it. That sounds infuriating. It's her restaurant's soul, and she trusts me to carry it, but she can't quite let go either. Talia turned her glass in slow circles the way he had his. I think we might have more in common than either of us wants to admit. Don't get used to it, Seo-jun said. But there was no real heat in it. Just something dry and almost fond. A rhythm they were finding without meaning to. Wouldn't dream of it, Talia said, and found, to her genuine surprise, that she was smiling when she said it. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the back garden of Hart's table, under a trellis of string lights that Talia's mother had insisted on despite Talia's protests that this was a legal formality, not an actual wedding. It's still a wedding, her mother, Deborah, had said, adjusting the collar of Talia's dress. Not white, because Talia had refused white on principle, but a deep, rich emerald green that made her skin glow. Doesn't matter why it's happening. You only get married once. Might as well look beautiful doing it. I might get married again in 6 months when I divorce him, Talia muttered. Hush, Deborah said, and pinned a small cluster of baby's breath into her daughter's twisted updo. You look gorgeous. Stop fighting it. Through the window, Talia could see the garden filling up. 40, maybe 50 people, mostly family and a scattering of press that Pierce had negotiated down to a manageable number in exchange for one approved photo. Yongtae stood near the front in a formal hanbok, looking, for the first time since Talia had met him, almost nervous. Odessa sat in a chair near the altar, a cane at her side that she used more for punctuation than actual support, dressed in deep purple, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief even though the ceremony hadn't started. And then Talia saw Seo-jun. He stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, no hanbok, hands clasped in front of him, and even from this distance she could see the tension in his shoulders. But when the doors opened and she started down the makeshift aisle between the restaurant's own wrought iron patio tables, he looked up, and something in his face changed. It wasn't love. She wasn't naive enough to think that. But it was something, surprise, maybe, or a kind of reluctant appreciation, like he hadn't quite expected her to be beautiful and was annoyed at himself for noticing. She reached the altar. Up close, she could see he'd nicked himself shaving, a small red mark near his jaw, and for some reason that tiny human imperfection did more to calm her nerves than anything else could have. You look terrified, she whispered as the officiant, a family friend of Odessa's, ordained online for exactly this purpose, shuffled his papers. I am terrified, Seo-jun whispered back. You look, he stopped himself. I look what? Nothing. Never mind. You can't start a sentence and not finish it. That's cruel. You look like someone I could actually stand being married to for 6 months, he said finally, low enough that only she could hear it, and it was such a strange, backhanded, honest thing to say that Talia laughed out loud, right there at the altar, drawing startled looks from the front row. Was that a compliment? She whispered. I don't know. Was it good enough? It's the nicest thing you've said to me since we met. The bar was extremely low. It really was. The officiant cleared his throat pointedly, and they both straightened, biting back smiles, and Talia thought, with the same startled clarity she'd felt in the lawyer's office weeks ago, this might actually be survivable. The vows were short, practical, legally necessary rather than romantic, until they reached the part where the officiant asked them to say something in their own words, which neither of them had prepared for, because neither of them had expected to need to. Seo-jun went first. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. I don't know you, he said. Not yet. But I know you built something worth fighting for, the same way my family did. And I know that whatever the next 6 months look like, I'd rather build a truce with you than keep fighting a war neither of us started. So I promise to try. That's all I've got. I promise to try. Talia's throat tightened unexpectedly. She hadn't planned to feel anything today beyond irritation and resignation. And yet here she was, blinking back something suspiciously close to tears at a man she'd hated on principle for 6 years, telling a garden full of strangers that he'd try. "I promised to try, too," she said when it was her turn, because she couldn't think of anything better, and because it was, unexpectedly, true. "And I promise not to poison your food, even though I've thought about it. A lot." Laughter rippled through the garden. Even Yongtae cracked a smile. Seo-jun's mouth twitched, fighting a real grin. "Rings?" the officiant prompted, and Talia's cousin stepped forward with a small velvet pillow. 2 simple gold bands, plain, unpretentious, chosen by Pierce's office because neither of them had wanted to be involved in ring shopping for a marriage neither of them wanted. Seo-jun slid the ring onto her finger, his hands steady despite everything, his thumb brushing briefly over her knuckles in a way that sent an unexpected shiver up her arm. She did the same for him, and his ring finger was warm, and for one absurd second she thought about how strange it was that she now knew the temperature of his skin. "By the power vested in me," the officiant said, "and, frankly, by the power vested in a 52-year-old real estate clause, I now pronounce you married. You may kiss the bride." Talia's heart lurched. They hadn't discussed this part. She looked up at Seo-jun, who looked equally caught off guard, and for a moment they just stared at each other, the whole garden holding its breath. Then he leaned down, slow enough to be polite, careful enough that she could have stopped him, and kissed her. It was brief, chaste even by wedding standards, lips soft, warm, closed, lasting maybe 2 seconds. But it still knocked something loose in her chest, some assumption she'd been carrying since the lawyer's office that this would be purely transactional, purely strategic, no feeling involved. When he pulled back, his eyes were wide, like he'd surprised himself too. "Sorry," he murmured, so only she could hear. "Reflex." "That was not a reflex," Talia murmured back, cheeks warm. "No," he admitted. "It wasn't." The garden erupted in applause. Somewhere, Odessa was openly crying now, and Yongtae had his hand pressed to his chest like the sight of them had physically moved him, and Talia stood there in her green dress with her hand in Seo-jun's, married to a man she'd hated a month ago, feeling something dangerously close to hope. The lease on Talia's apartment ran out 2 weeks after the wedding, a coincidence that felt engineered by the universe specifically to inconvenience her. And so, because appearances mattered, because reporters had already staked out both restaurants twice, because Pierce insisted a plausible cohabitation would matter if the trust dissolution was ever legally challenged, she moved into Seo-jun's condo. It was a beautiful place, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable, and turned out, when she finally sat on the gray couch with a glass of wine on her 3rd night there, to be surprisingly soft. "You could at least pretend to be unhappy about the couch," Seo-jun said, walking in from the kitchen with 2 plates of food. "I built a whole personality around people being intimidated by my minimalist aesthetic." "The couch is a lie," Talia said. "Everything else about this place says, I will judge you silently for existing. But this couch says, come sit on me and cry about your day. That's an oddly specific red. I contain multitudes." She eyed the plates as he set them on the coffee table. "What is this?" "Doenjang jjigae, fermented soybean stew. My mother's recipe, more or less." He hesitated. "You don't have to eat it if you don't want to. I run a restaurant, Seo-jun. I'm not scared of soybeans." She took a bite before he could second-guess himself further, and her eyebrows went up, the same reaction she'd gotten out of him with the coffee, weeks ago, and something in his face relaxed at the sight of it. "Okay, that's really good. Where'd you learn to cook like this?" "My mother, mostly. She died when I was 14, car accident. And afterward, cooking her recipes was the only way I felt like I still had her around. My grandfather thinks it's a hobby beneath the CEO of a 40-location restaurant chain. I think he's wrong, but I've stopped arguing with him about most things." Talia set her fork down. "I'm sorry. About your mom. It was a long time ago. Doesn't mean it doesn't still hurt." Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, that she hadn't offered the usual platitudes. "No," he agreed quietly. "It doesn't." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. The city lights spread out below the windows, and Talia found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected to, in this apartment, with this man, In this marriage neither of them had asked for. "Can I ask you something?" Seo-jun said eventually. "Depends on the something." "Why'd you say yes?" "At the lawyer's office. You said it faster than I did." Talia considered the question, turning her wine glass slowly. "Because my grandmother's the only family I've got left who really understands what that restaurant means. My parents love it, but it's not theirs the way it's hers. The way it's mine now. If I'd said no and we lost it to some trust neither of us controlled, I don't think she would have survived that. Not really. Not the way that matters." "That's a very good reason." "What's yours?" "My grandfather's the only family I have left. Period," Seo-jun said. "And Choi Garden isn't just a business to him. It's proof that he made it. That leaving Korea with nothing and building something here meant something. If I let that get sold off in a trust dispute because I was too proud to sign a marriage certificate, I don't think I could live with myself. Or with him. Or, frankly, with my father's memory, if that makes sense." "It does," Talia said softly. "So, same reason, really. Just different grandparent." "Different grandparent. Same stubbornness." "I prefer to call it loyalty. Call it whatever you want. It looks the same from the outside." But she was smiling when she said it, and so was he, and the space between them on the too-soft couch felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, though neither of them had moved. "For what it's worth," Seo-jun said, quieter now, "I'm glad it's you. If I had to marry someone I hated on principle for a legal technicality, I'm glad it's someone who actually gets it." Talia looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, past the expensive suit hanging in the closet down the hall and the coldness he'd worn like armor in that lawyer's office, down to the man underneath who cooked his dead mother's recipes on Sundays and hadn't wanted the lawsuit any more than she had. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." Choi Garden's flagship location had a private event room on the second floor, all dark wood and soft lighting, and it was there 3 weeks into the marriage that Pierce had scheduled a joint press conference to address what the tabloids had started calling the alley wedding. Talia stood backstage in a fitted burgundy dress, running through talking points Pierce's associate had drafted, while Seo-jun paced a few feet away in a navy suit, jaw tight. "You're going to wear a groove in the floor," she said. "I hate this. I hate all of this. Public relations theater dressed up as a marriage." "I know." She stepped closer, fixed his tie without thinking about it. A small domestic gesture that felt strange and natural at the same time. "But it's almost over. 5 more months. We survive today, we survive the rest." He looked down at her hands still resting on his tie, then up at her face. "You're better at this than me. The performing. I run a restaurant during a Saturday dinner rush with a broken walk-in and a health inspector showing up unannounced. This is nothing. That's oddly reassuring. Come on." She held out her hand. "Let's go be adorable for the cameras." He laughed. Actually laughed, a real sound, surprised out of him, and took her hand, and they walked out together into a room full of flashing cameras and shouted questions, and Talia realized, with a small jolt, that she hadn't had to fake the smile at all. The questions were exactly as invasive as she'd expected. How did you fall in love? Was it really an arranged marriage? Are the rumors of a business rivalry true? Pierce had prepped them to keep answers vague, warm, unspecific, a whirlwind romance narrative that skirted the actual truth without technically lying. It was Seo-jun, unexpectedly, who went off script. "The truth," he said, when a reporter pushed harder than the rest, "is that our families have history, complicated history. We didn't fall into this the way people usually fall in love. We were pushed into it by circumstances neither of us controlled." He glanced at Talia, and something steadied in his voice. "But I've learned more about partnership from these last few weeks than I expected to. Talia runs her restaurant with more heart than most people I've worked with in this industry-run entire companies. I respect her. That's not nothing." The room went quiet for a beat. Talia felt heat climb up her neck, unrelated to the camera flashes. "And you, Mrs. Choi?" a reporter started, and Talia startled slightly at the name, unused to it. "What do you respect about your husband?" She looked at Seo-jun, at the tired eyes, the careful hands, The man who cooked his dead mother's stew on Sundays and had just unprompted defended her in front of a room full of press. "He shows up," she said simply. "For his grandfather, for his company, for people he doesn't even particularly like yet. That's rarer than people think." Seo-jun's hand tightened around hers, just slightly, and under the table where no camera could see, his thumb brushed over her knuckles again. The same gesture from the wedding, and Talia thought, not for the first time, that she was in more trouble than she'd bargained for. 3 weeks turned into 6, and somewhere in the accumulation of shared breakfasts and late-night television and the small, unremarkable rhythms of actually living with someone, Talia found herself looking forward to Sundays. Sundays were cooking days. Seo-jun in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, sleeves rolled up, humming something under his breath that she was pretty sure was a K-pop song he'd never admit to liking. Talia usually joined him by 7, drawn out of bed by the smell of garlic and sesame oil, still in pajama shorts and one of his old t-shirts that she'd claimed without asking. "You're stealing my clothes," he said one Sunday, not looking up from the cutting board where he was mincing garlic with practiced speed. "They're comfortable. They're mine. They're comfortable and mine now. Community property. We're married, remember? For 5 more months. Plenty of time to steal more shirts." He huffed something that was almost a laugh and slid a plate of half-finished banchan toward her. "Taste this. Tell me if it needs more vinegar." She tasted it. Cucumber, something sharp and bright, a little sweet underneath, and considered it with the seriousness of someone who'd been evaluating flavors professionally for a decade. A little more vinegar, and maybe a pinch more sugar to balance it, not less. He tasted it again, adjusted, tasted a 3rd time, and nodded slowly. "You're right. How'd you know that?" "Same principle as pickled greens. Soul food cooking's got more overlap with Korean food than people think. Fermentation, using every part of the animal, building flavor in layers instead of dumping salt on everything at once. My grandmother would probably love your grandmother's kimchi recipe, if either of them would ever admit that out loud. They'd sooner die. Obviously, pride runs deep in both our families." She hopped up onto the counter beside the stove, watching him work, something warm and unguarded settling over her that she hadn't let herself feel around him before. "Can I ask you something? Actual question, not deflection." "Go ahead. Do you actually want to run Choi Garden? Or is it just obligation? Your dad, your grandfather, all of it?" Seo-jun's hands stilled over the cutting board for a moment. It was the kind of question, she realized, that he probably hadn't let himself sit with in a long time. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "I used to. When I was a kid, I used to follow my dad around the flagship location, and I loved it, the smell of the grills, the way he talked to every single customer like they were the only person in the room. After he died, it stopped feeling like something I loved and started feeling like something I owed him. I don't know how to separate those two things anymore. That's a lot to carry." "Yeah." He resumed chopping, slower now. "What about you? Do you love the restaurant? Or is it obligation too?" "Both, probably. Like you." She picked at the banchan he'd set aside, stealing a piece of cucumber. "But some mornings, when I'm in the kitchen before anyone else gets there, prepping greens, and the lights coming through the windows just right, I love it so much it scares me. It doesn't feel like obligation in those moments. It feels like the only thing that's ever fully made sense." "I want that," Seo-jun said quietly. "Whatever that feeling is, I want to find it again. Maybe you will. Maybe." He looked at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression that she was starting to recognize as entirely different from the man she'd met in the lawyer's office. "Maybe I already am, a little. Sundays, at least." Talia's heart did something complicated and unwise. "Sundays are good," she agreed, quieter than she meant to. "Sundays are good," he echoed, and went back to the garlic. But the air between them had shifted, warm and charged in a way neither of them commented on, and Talia sat on the counter in his stolen t-shirt and thought, with mounting alarm, that she was falling for her husband. It didn't last, of course, nothing that easy ever did, and the first real fight came 4 days later, sparked by something so small it was almost embarrassing in retrospect. Talia had come home late from an unexpected health inspection at Hart's table, stressed and snappish, to find Seo-jun on the phone in the living room, voice tight, saying something about the Ashby location and renegotiating the lease terms that made her stomach drop before she'd even fully processed the words. "What was that?" she asked, the second he hung up. "Business." "Whose business, specifically?" Seo-jun set his phone down carefully, a gesture she was starting to recognize as him buying time. "My grandfather wants to expand the Ashby location. Add outdoor seating. It would require using part of the shared alley. Legally, now that the property's back under joint ownership discussions, and I told him I'd look into it. The alley we're both supposed to have equal claim to. That alley. Talia, it's just, you're negotiating to take space from my restaurant while we're still married, Seo-jun. While the trust dissolution isn't even finalized yet. I said I'd look into it, not that I agreed to it. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it sounds exactly like the same thing your family's been doing for 6 years. Taking what you want and calling it business, and expecting the rest of us to just absorb it." Something hardened in his face, the openness of the last few weeks folding shut like a door. "That's not fair. Isn't it? You just told me your grandfather wants to eat into my alley space, and your first instinct wasn't to say no on my behalf, it was to say you'd look into it. That tells me exactly where I rank. I haven't agreed to anything. You haven't disagreed either. Because I was going to talk to you about it before making any decision, which is apparently a crime now, since you clearly already think the worst of me regardless of what I actually do." "I don't think the worst of you. You do. You just proved it. The second business came up, you went right back to seeing me as the enemy, exactly like 6 weeks ago, and honestly," his voice cracked, just slightly, with something that sounded more like hurt than anger. "That's exhausting, Talia. I've been trying really hard, and it apparently doesn't matter because the second something threatens your restaurant, I'm right back to being a Choi you can't trust." The words landed harder than she expected, mostly because they weren't wrong. "That's not," she started and then stopped, because she didn't actually have a good end to that sentence. Seo-jun looked at her for a long moment, something exhausted and raw in his face, and then he grabbed his coat off the back of the couch. "I need air." "Seo-jun." But the door had already closed behind him, and Talia stood alone in the too-quiet apartment, staring at the space where he'd been, feeling something in her chest that felt uncomfortably close to grief for a fight she'd mostly started. He didn't come home that night. Talia knew because she stayed up until 3 in the morning on the too-soft couch, phone in hand, not calling him, too proud to be the one to break first, and then finally fell asleep sometime after 4, curled up in one of his stolen t-shirts, furious at herself for the tears that had leaked out somewhere around 1 a.m. She found him the next morning in the alley. The 11 feet of cracked concrete that had started this whole mess. Standing on his side of the property line, coffee in hand, staring at the wall of her restaurant like it had personally wronged him. "You didn't come home," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I stayed at the flagship location. There's a cot in the back office. I've slept there before, during bad stretches after my dad died." "I'm sorry," Talia said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in weeks. "About last night. You were right. I did go straight back to thinking the worst of you, and that wasn't fair, not after everything you've actually shown me these last 6 weeks." Seo-jun didn't say anything for a moment, just turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I called my grandfather at midnight," he said finally. "Told him I wasn't interested in expanding into shared alley space. Not now, not after the trust dissolves, not ever, unless it's a conversation between equals, not a land grab dressed up as expansion. You didn't have to do that because of our fight. I didn't do it because of our fight. I did it because you were right to be angry, even if you were angry at the wrong moment for the wrong reasons. My family's taken things from yours for years without really seeing it as taking. I don't want to be part of that pattern anymore. Not with you. Not with anyone, honestly, but especially not with you." Something in Talia's chest cracked open, warm and terrified all at once. "Seo-jun, I need to say something," he cut in. "And I need you to let me say it without interrupting, because if I stop now, I don't think I'll get the courage back." She nodded, throat tight. "I didn't want this marriage," he said. 6 weeks ago, I would have done almost anything to get out of it. I hated the idea of being tied to someone because of a 52-year-old real estate clause, hated the idea of my life being decided by two men who are both dead now and can't even see what they set in motion. But somewhere in the last 6 weeks, this stopped feeling like an obligation. He looked up, and his eyes were dark and steady and terrifyingly honest. It started feeling like something I actually wanted. You. This. Sundays in the kitchen. Fighting with you about alley space and then finding out you're actually right and having to sit with that and respecting you more for it, not less. I don't know when that happened, but it happened, and last night, when you looked at me like I was the enemy again, it scared me more than the lawsuit ever did. Because I realized how much I'd started to care what you thought of me. Talia's breath caught. The alley, of all places. The ugliest, most contested 11 feet of real estate in the city. Ground zero for 6 years of pettiness and one very unexpected marriage. Suddenly felt like the most important place she'd ever stood. I stayed up until 4 in the morning last night, she admitted, voice unsteady. Not because I was angry. Well, I was angry. But mostly because I missed you, which is insane because you'd been gone for like 6 hours, and I don't know when I started missing you when you're not in the room, but I do now, and it terrifies me too. Talia, I think I'm falling for you, she said, before she lost her nerve. I think I fell for you somewhere between the coffee in this alley and the Dunjang Jigi, and you defending me to a room full of reporters, and I have spent the last week trying very hard to pretend that isn't happening, because we agreed to 6 months and a clean exit, and falling for my husband was not part of the plan. Seo-jun set his coffee cup down on the low wall between their two buildings, the physical boundary that had defined a 6-year war, and crossed the remaining distance between them. Plans change, he said softly, and cupped her face in both hands. And this time, when he kissed her, it wasn't a reflex, and it wasn't for the cameras, and it wasn't chaste. It was slow and searching, and full of 6 weeks of careful distance finally collapsing. His hands warm against her jaw, her fingers curling into the front of his coat to pull him closer, the cold morning air and the ugly cracked concrete and the two restaurants looming on either side of them entirely forgotten. When they finally broke apart, foreheads still touching, both of them a little breathless, Seo-jun laughed, soft, disbelieving, happy in a way she hadn't heard from him before. I can't believe I'm about to say this, he murmured. But I think our dead grandfathers might have actually known what they were doing. Don't let it go to your head, Talia said, smiling against his mouth. They still built the ugliest alley in the entire city. The ugliest alley in the city, he agreed. That I would apparently do it all again for. Odessa Monroe-Hart had a way of summoning people that felt less like an invitation and more like a subpoena, and so it was that 2 weeks after the alley kiss, Talia found herself walking into Hart's table on a slow Tuesday afternoon, Seo-jun's hand laced through hers, to face her grandmother across the same corner booth Odessa had occupied every day for 30 years. Sit, Odessa said. Not looking up from the pot of greens, she was somehow still stirring despite technically being retired from the line. Both of you. They sat. Talia recognized the particular set of her grandmother's shoulders, the one that meant a lecture was coming, dressed up as concern. I heard about the alley, Odessa said. Talia's stomach dropped. Heard what, exactly? That my granddaughter was photographed kissing her husband on a public sidewalk like a fool in love, in full view of the security camera your Uncle Reggie insisted on installing after the trash bag incident. Odessa finally looked up, and her expression was harder to read than Talia expected. Not disapproval exactly, but something more careful. Sit down before you fall down, girl, you've gone pale. It's not. We weren't performing for anyone, Grandma. That wasn't for the cameras. I know it wasn't. That's exactly my concern. Odessa set down her spoon and folded her hands on the table, the same posture she'd held at the lawyer's office months ago. Seo-jun. Look at me. He did, sitting up a little straighter, the way Talia imagined he must have sat up straighter for his own grandfather his whole life. You understand, Odessa said, that in 5 months, the trust dissolves whether either of you feel a single thing for each other or not. That was always the arrangement. Marriage on paper, property back where it belongs, and then the two of you are free to go your separate ways with no hard feelings on either side. I understand that, Seo-jun said carefully. Then I need to know, Odessa continued, Whether what I'm looking at right now, my granddaughter holding your hand like she's forgotten how to let go of it, is something real, or something that's going to break her heart in 5 months when the paperwork's done and there's no more reason for either of you to stay. The question hung in the air, heavier than Talia had expected, and she realized with a lurch that she and Seo-jun hadn't actually had this conversation themselves yet. Not directly, not in these terms. They'd fallen into something warm and unspoken over the last 2 weeks. More kisses in the kitchen, hands finding each other on the couch during late-night television. A closeness that had felt too new and too fragile to interrogate out loud. But her grandmother, with her usual unerring instinct for the thing nobody wanted to say, had just forced the question into the open. Seo-jun didn't look away from Odessa, and he didn't let go of Talia's hand. "Ma'am, I can't promise you certainty," he said. "I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life. Wrong about my grandfather, wrong about what I wanted from this company, wrong about your granddaughter 6 weeks ago, when I thought marrying her would be the worst thing that ever happened to me." He glanced at Talia, something steady and warm in his eyes. "But I'm not planning to let 5 months be a deadline. If she'll have me, really have me, pass the paperwork, pass the trust, I'd like to stay married to her. Not because of a real estate clause. Because I want to." Odessa studied him for a long, silent moment. The kind of assessment Talia had watched her grandmother apply to suppliers, to line cooks, to every single person who'd ever tried to marry into or work alongside this family. Then, slowly, something in her face softened. "Well," she said, "at least you've got sense enough not to lie to an old woman." She turned to Talia. "And you? What do you want, baby? Separate from what he wants, separate from what I want, separate from any of this business with the property." Talia thought about Sunday mornings and Dunjang Jigi and an alley kiss that had felt more honest than almost anything else in her life, and found, to her own relief, that the answer came easily. "I want him," she said simply. "Past the 5 months. I don't care about the deadline anymore." Odessa's eyes went bright and wet, though her voice stayed brisk. "Well, good, because Thomas would have loved this. Loved watching 2 stubborn young fools fall for each other over an alley. He and Dukwon fought the city planning commission for 40 years ago." She picked her spoon back up, dismissing them both with the particular efficiency of a woman who'd said her piece and had greens to finish. "Now get out of my kitchen, both of you, before the lunch rush starts and I put you to work." They left laughing, hands still linked, and Talia thought that maybe, despite everything, despite the lawsuit and the reversion clause and 6 years of petty feuding, her grandmother had just given them her blessing in the only language Odessa Monroe-Hart had ever really spoken, through a pot of greens and a hard, loving interrogation. If Odessa's approval came wrapped in vegetables and cross-examination, Yongtae's came differently, quieter, heavier, delivered 3 days later in the private dining room at Choi Garden's flagship location, over a meal he'd cooked himself, which Seo-jun told her afterward was almost unheard of. "My grandfather hasn't cooked for anyone but family in 15 years, he murmured to Talia as they sat down. "This is either a very good sign or a very bad one." It turned out to be neither, exactly. It was something more complicated, more human, than either of them expected. Yongtae served the food himself, refusing help from the staff, setting down plate after plate of galbi, japchae, a soup Talia didn't recognize that smelled achingly of ginger and something warm underneath. When he finally sat, he looked older than Talia had ever seen him, the weight of something visibly pressing on his shoulders. "I owe you both an apology," he said without preamble. Seo-jun set down his chopsticks. "Grandfather, let me finish." Yongtae folded his hands, an echo of Odessa's posture from days before, and Talia wondered if that was simply what a certain generation of stubborn elders did when they had something difficult to say. "I filed that lawsuit knowing about the reversion clause." The table went silent. "You knew," Talia said slowly. "I found the original deed 18 months ago, buried in a box of Dukwon's papers that his daughter finally sent me after he passed. I read the clause. I understood exactly what would happen if the alley dispute went to court." Yongtae's jaw tightened, an old man's version of Seo-jun's stubborn set. "I filed anyway. Why?" Seo-jun's voice had gone tight, controlled in a way that told Talia he was working hard to stay calm. Because I am an old fool who has watched his grandson bury himself alive in spreadsheets and lease negotiations since his father died. With no joy in his face, no life outside this business, nothing but obligation. Yongtae said, and his voice cracked on the last word. And because I remembered what it was like 52 years ago when Dukwon and Thomas built this place from nothing. How much joy there was in it, how much partnership, how it never felt like a burden because they carried it together. I wanted that for you. I didn't know how else to give it to you except by force. You manipulated a lawsuit, Seo-jun said, to force me into an arranged marriage because you thought I needed a wife. I thought you needed a partner. Yongtae corrected, quiet but firm. In business, in life, in everything you've been carrying alone since your father died. I was wrong to do it the way I did it. I know that. I've known it since the day I watched your face at that lawyer's office and saw how much you hated me for it. But I am not sorry it worked. His eyes moved to Talia, softer now. I have watched my grandson smile more in the last 2 months than he has in the last 4 years. That is not nothing, whatever you think of how it happened. Talia looked at Seo-jun, watching the anger and hurt and something more complicated war across his face. Betrayal she recognized, but also, underneath it, a kind of exhausted, reluctant understanding. You should have told me, Seo-jun said finally. Before the lawsuit. Before any of it. You should have just told me you were worried about me, instead of manufacturing an entire legal crisis. Would you have listened? Yongtae asked, and it wasn't a challenge, just an honest question. When was the last time you listened to me about anything that wasn't a spreadsheet? Seo-jun didn't have an answer for that, and the silence stretched, heavy and complicated, until Talia, feeling suddenly, strangely, like the only person in the room capable of steering this conversation somewhere survivable, reached over and put her hand on Seo-jun's arm. For what it's worth, she said, looking between the two men, I'm furious on principle that either of our grandparents thought manipulating a legal dispute was an acceptable way to plan a wedding. That's genuinely unhinged behavior, and I want that on the record. Yongtae's mouth twitched, almost a smile. But I also don't regret how any of this turned out. So I don't really know what to do with that anger. It's got nowhere honest to go. That's exactly the problem, Seo-jun muttered. But some of the tension had left his shoulders. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight, Yongtae said. I am asking you to eat the food I made, because it took me 3 hours. And because I am an old man who doesn't have many more years left to cook for the people he loves, however badly he's shown that love. He looked at his grandson, something raw and unguarded in his weathered face. I am proud of you, Seo-jun. I don't say that enough. I am proud of the man you've become, even though, especially because, I had to trick you into finding your way back to joy. Seo-jun was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, and then, finally, he picked his chopsticks back up. The galbi's good, he said, voice rough. You always did make it better than the restaurant version. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet. But it was a start, and Talia, watching grandfather and grandson find their way back toward each other over a dinner neither of them had wanted to have, thought that maybe some kinds of love only ever arrived sideways, disguised as stubbornness, disguised as manipulation, disguised as an old man's fear of losing what was left of his family. It should have ended there, warm and settled, 2 grandparents' blessings secured, 2 hearts genuinely tangled together. And for a while, it did feel like the hardest part was behind them. Then, 3 weeks before the trust was set to dissolve, a reporter from a regional business magazine published a story that changed everything. Talia found out about it the way most disasters find people now. Through her phone, buzzing insistently on the nightstand at 6 in the morning. 3 missed calls from her grandmother, and a text from Pierce that simply read, "Call me now." The headline, when she finally pulled it up, made her stomach drop straight through the floor. Arranged for profit. Sources say Choi Air plotted alley, wedding to absorb rival restaurants' real estate. The article was sourced anonymously, a person close to the Choi family, and alleged that Seo-jun had known about the reversion clause months before the lawsuit was filed, that he'd pushed his grandfather to file it specifically to force the marriage, that the entire courtship had been calculated from the start as a strategy to eventually absorb Hart's table into Choi Garden's expanding footprint. It cited the recent conversation about Ashby location expansion, twisted now, stripped of context, made to look like proof of a long-game land grab. Talia's hands were shaking by the time she finished reading it. Talia! Seo-jun's voice, from the doorway, groggy with sleep, going instantly alert at the look on her face. What's wrong? She turned the phone toward him without a word. He read it in silence, his face going pale, then tight, then something worse. A kind of stricken, cornered stillness that Talia recognized, with a sick lurch as guilt. You knew, she said slowly, watching his face, about the alley expansion conversation being twisted. But is there more? Did you actually know about the clause before the lawsuit? No, Seo-jun said immediately, firmly. Talia, I swear to you, I didn't know about the reversion clause until we were sitting in that lawyer's office together. I found out the same moment you did. Then who's the source? Who's talking to reporters about private conversations we had in our own home? Seo-jun's jaw tightened. I don't know, but I have a guess. The guess turned out to be Hannah, Seo-jun's cousin, the spreadsheet-wielding one-star view saboteur from years past, who'd never made peace with the idea of a Monroe-Hart marrying into the family and had, it emerged over several increasingly ugly phone calls that afternoon, been feeding a reporter selectively edited details for weeks, hoping to derail the marriage before the trust could dissolve and cement Talia's family's equal claim to the property. She's been angling for a bigger stake in the company since my father died, Seo-jun said, pacing the length of the living room that evening. Phone clutched so hard his knuckles had gone white. If the trust dissolves and Hart's table retains its half of the property permanently, that's less territory for eventual Choi garden expansion. She thought if she could plant enough doubt, enough scandal, maybe the marriage would collapse before the 6 months were up and the courts would have to intervene differently. So she was willing to burn my restaurant's reputation, and yours, to protect a business expansion that isn't even hers to protect. Yes. Talia sat down heavily on the couch, the too soft couch that had felt like safety for months now and currently felt like nothing could hold her up. Half the city thinks I married a man who was plotting to steal my family's restaurant the whole time. I'll fix this, Seo-jun said. I'll issue a statement. I'll get Hannah to go on record retracting. Will you? The words came out sharper than Talia intended, fear curdling into something meaner. Because from where I'm sitting, every single fear I had at that lawyer's office 6 months ago just got printed in a magazine with your family's name attached. What if some of it's true? What if part of you, even a small part, even a part you don't fully admit to yourself, did see an opportunity in all this? Seo-jun went very still. You don't actually believe that. I don't know what I believe right now. I believe that your cousin has apparently been planning to sabotage this marriage for weeks and you didn't know, which means there are things happening around us that we don't see, and that terrifies me because I have 5 months, 3 weeks now where everything I've built could still be at risk, and I don't know how to separate the man who cooks me soybean stew on Sundays from the family that's been trying to take pieces of my restaurant for 6 years. That's not fair, Seo-jun said, voice going tight and wounded in a way that mirrored their first fight, months ago, in this same apartment. I have done nothing but try to prove to you, every single day, that I am not that I never wanted the alley, never wanted an expansion at your expense, never wanted anything from this marriage except. He stopped himself, breathing hard. Except what? Except you, he said, quieter now, raw. I wanted you, Talia. Not your restaurant, not your side of the property line. You. And it kills me that after everything. After the alley, after Sundays, after telling your grandmother I wanted to stay married to you past the deadline. You'd look at me right now like I'm the enemy again, because my cousin did something ugly behind both our backs. Talia opened her mouth, some retort half-formed, and then closed it again, because the accusation landed exactly where it was meant to, sharp and true. She'd done this before, the same instinct months ago in the same room, reaching for suspicion, the second business and betrayal tangled together, punishing him for things he hadn't done because it was easier than sitting with fear she didn't know how to hold otherwise. I'm scared, she admitted finally, voice cracking. I'm scared that everything good between us is going to get buried under everything ugly between our families. The way it always has been. The way it was before either of us had any say in it. I know, Seo-jun said. and some of the hurt in his voice softened into something more exhausted, more tender. I'm scared too. But scared isn't the same as guilty, Talia, and I need you to be able to tell the difference, because if you can't, if every hard moment sends you straight back to seeing my last name instead of me, I don't know how we build anything that lasts past 3 weeks, let alone a lifetime. The words sat heavy in the room, and Talia realized, with a sinking, humbling clarity, that this was the actual test. Not the lawsuit, not the reversion clause, not even the arranged wedding itself. This was it. Whether she could choose to trust him even when the ground felt unstable, even when old fear whispered louder than new love. I need some air, she said finally, echoing his own words from their first fight, and watched something flicker with old, familiar hurt across his face as she grabbed her coat and left. She ended up at Hart's table, unsurprisingly, in the empty dining room after closing, sitting in her grandmother's corner booth with a mug of chicory coffee she hadn't touched, staring at nothing. Odessa found her there 20 minutes later, having clearly been called by someone. Seo-jun, probably, unable to leave things unresolved even in anger, still looking out for her even mid-fight, and slid into the booth across from her without a word, setting a plate of buttermilk biscuits between them like an offering. You saw the article, Talia said. I saw the article. I also called that reporter's editor myself an hour ago and gave her a piece of my mind about journalistic standards, which she did not appreciate, but she's going to run a correction by tomorrow regardless. Odessa broke open a biscuit, buttered it with the unhurried precision of a woman who'd spent 70 years believing food solved most problems that words couldn't. You want to tell me what's really going on? Or you want to keep staring at that coffee like it did something to you? Talia told her. The article, the fight, the accusation she'd flung at Seo-jun that she now, in the quiet of the empty restaurant, recognized as unfair. Odessa listened without interrupting, which was rarer than Talia's own storm of feelings, and when she finished, her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. You know, Odessa said finally, your grandfather and I fought like that once, early on. Somebody spread a rumor that he was seeing another woman on his delivery route. Wasn't true, not a word of it, but I believed it for 3 days because I was young and scared, and it was easier to believe the worst than sit with how much I already loved him. What happened? I nearly threw him out over a lie some jealous fool told me out of spite. And then I sat right here, in this booth, same as you're sitting now, and asked myself a question that changed my whole life. Odessa reached across the table and took Talia's hand, the same grip from the lawyer's office months ago, steel wrapped in soft, papery skin. I asked myself, has this man, in every single moment I've actually witnessed with my own eyes, shown me who he really is? Or have I let one ugly rumor outweigh 100 good mornings? Talia's throat tightened. Baby, Odessa said, gentler now. That boy stood up in front of a room full of reporters and defended you without being asked to. He told his own grandfather no about that alley expansion the second you raised a concern. He apologizes when he's wrong and he holds his ground when he's right, and from what I've watched these last 2 months, he loves you the way your grandfather loved me, quietly, stubbornly, in the small moments nobody's paying attention to. Are you going to let his cousin's spite convince you otherwise? I said something cruel to him, Talia admitted. I basically accused him of using this whole marriage to get closer to stealing the restaurant. Then you go home, Odessa said. And you apologize properly, the way I should have apologized to your grandfather instead of making him grovel for 3 days over a rumor that wasn't even true. Pride is a poor substitute for love, Talia. It keeps you warm for about a minute and then it leaves you alone in an empty restaurant at midnight, same as it's got you right now. Talia laughed, wet and unsteady. You're very wise for someone who once threw a man out over gossip. I said nearly threw him out. I came to my senses fast enough, and so will you, if you stop wasting time sitting in my booth eating my biscuits and go tell that boy you're sorry. She found him exactly where she expected to, in the alley, standing at the low wall between their 2 buildings, the same spot where he told her plans change, the same spot where she told him she was falling for him. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and he was still there, coat collar turned up against the cold, looking like he hadn't moved in hours. You're going to catch a cold, Talia said, coming to a stop a few feet away. I wasn't sure you'd want me anywhere near your building tonight. I wasn't sure either. I came anyway. She crossed the remaining distance, close enough now to see the exhaustion etched into his face, and reached for his hand, cold from the night air. I'm sorry. What I said, accusing you of scheming even a little bit, even for a second, that wasn't fair and it wasn't true, and I knew it wasn't true even as I said it. I just got scared, and scared made me cruel, and I'm sorry. Seo-jun's fingers curled around hers, tight, like he'd been waiting hours for permission to hold on. I understand the fear. I do. 6 years of feuding families doesn't disappear because two people fell for each other over Dunjang Jigi. But Talia... He turned to face her fully, something urgent and open in his expression. I need you to know that I am never going to be the man in that article. Whatever my cousin says, whatever anyone prints, I am not after your restaurant. I was never after your restaurant. I am after you, for as long as you'll have me, past 3 weeks, past the trust dissolving, past every deadline anyone else ever tried to put on us. I know, Talia said, and meant it fully now, the fear from earlier finally settling into something steadier. I know that. My grandmother reminded me of something I should have known on my own, that I've watched you, with my own eyes, for 2 months now, and every single thing you've shown me says exactly who you are. I let one ugly article outweigh all of that, for about an hour, and I'm sorry. An hour's forgivable, Seo-jun said, something like relief breaking across his face. I was worried it was going to be longer. I love you, Talia said, and the words came out easier than she expected, simple and true, like something that had been building for weeks and finally found its moment. I don't think I said that part out loud yet. I love you, Seo-jun, past the marriage certificate, past the trust, past any deadline. I want to stay married to you because I genuinely can't imagine my Sundays without you in that kitchen anymore. Badly humming songs you refuse to admit you like. Seo-jun laughed, startled and warm, and pulled her into him, forehead resting against hers the same way it had the first time, right here, in this same ugly alley. I love you too. I have for weeks. I just didn't know how to say it without it sounding like part of the performance everyone expects from us. This isn't a performance, Talia said. Not anymore. Maybe it started as one. But somewhere between the coffee and the biscuits and the reversion clause, it turned into something real. The realest thing I've ever built. Seo-jun agreed, and kissed her, slow and certain. The cold night air forgotten. The article forgotten. 6 years of feuding families forgotten. Just the two of them standing in the alley that had started it all, finally, fully certain of what they'd found. The magazine ran its correction the following week. A full retraction, an apology, and a follow-up piece that painted Hannah's sabotage in considerably less flattering terms than the original article had painted Seo-jun. Hannah herself was quietly removed from her position at Choi Garden's corporate offices, a decision Yongtae made without consulting his grandson, delivered instead as a kind of belated apology for the manipulation that had started all of this in the first place. 3 weeks later, on the exact date the trust was legally set to dissolve, Talia and Seo-jun stood once more in front of Elliot Pierce's desk, the same mahogany table, the same thick folder. Though this time, Talia noticed, Seo-jun's hand found hers before the meeting even started, and didn't let go. The lawsuit's been formally withdrawn, Pierce said, sliding a document across the table. Both families have signed off on the joint ownership agreement. Equal shares, permanently, no more ambiguity about the property line. The reversion clause is officially dissolved. As of today, you're both free. Free, Talia repeated, glancing at Seo-jun. Free to divorce if that's still the plan, Pierce clarified, glancing between them with the particular carefulness of a lawyer who'd clearly noticed the held hands and the soft looks and was choosing his words accordingly. Or free to do whatever else you'd like. The law no longer requires anything of either of you. We'd like to stay married, Seo-jun said, without hesitation, and Talia felt something warm bloom in her chest at how easily he said it. No doubt, no performance, just simple fact. If that's all right with everyone. Pierce almost smiled. An unusual sight, from a man who'd represented feuding families for decades and had likely seen every possible outcome to an arrangement like this one. It's more than all right. Frankly, it's the first time in 52 years this particular clause has actually done what those two old men probably hoped it would. Outside the office, in the parking lot, Odessa and Yongtae were waiting together. An unlikely pairing that had, over the last 2 months, become an increasingly common sight. The two elders bickering amiably over the phone about grandchildren and grease traps and whose kimchi recipe was actually better. A rivalry that had somehow transformed from lawsuit into genuine, prickly friendship. Well, Odessa called out, cane in one hand, the other shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. We're staying married, Talia said, and watched her grandmother's face crack open into the widest smile she'd seen in years. Of course you are, Yongtae said, looking entirely too pleased with himself. I told you it would work. You manipulated a lawsuit, Seo-jun reminded him, though there was no real heat in it anymore, just old, fond exasperation. That's not the same as knowing something would work. Semantics, Yongtae said, waving a hand. Now, since the property dispute is finally settled, I believe there's the small matter of a joint outdoor patio to discuss. Something that benefits both restaurants equally, this time. No sabotage, no secret expansion plans. I was thinking a shared garden space, right where that ugly alley currently sits. Talia and Seo-jun exchanged a look, surprised, then slowly, unmistakably delighted. A shared patio, Talia said, where Hart's table and Choi garden customers could actually sit together. Fusion menu nights, Seo-jun added, already turning it over. The businessman in him lighting up alongside the man who'd fallen in love in a kitchen full of banchan and greens. Soul food and Korean barbecue, side by side, the way it probably should have been from the start, if two stubborn old men hadn't spent 6 years pretending otherwise. I like it, Odessa said, tapping her cane decisively against the pavement. Thomas would have liked it too, turning the ugliest alley in the city into something worth sitting in. 6 months later, on a warm evening in early autumn, the alley between Hart's table and Choi Garden Barbecue reopened as a shared garden patio. String lights strung between the two buildings, mismatched furniture donated from both restaurants, a joint menu featuring collard greens braised with gochujang and galbi glazed with molasses, dishes that Talia and Seo-jun had spent weeks perfecting together in his kitchen on quiet Sunday mornings. Odessa and Yongtae sat at the head table for the reopening, bickering happily about whose family recipe deserved top billing on the new menu. Reporters showed up again, though this time the headlines were considerably kinder. From rivalry to romance, how an arranged marriage rebuilt a neighborhood, and Talia found, standing in the middle of the garden that had once been a battleground, Seo-jun's arm warm around her waist, that she didn't mind the cameras this time at all. No regrets, Seo-jun murmured against her temple, watching the crowd mingle beneath the string lights. Plates of fusion food passed hand to hand between two families who'd spent 6 years pretending they had nothing in common. None, Talia said, turning in his arms to face him fully. The alley, no, the garden now, transformed, reborn, glowing gold around them. Turns out our grandfathers weren't fools after all, just really terrible at showing their love in normal ways. Runs in the family, apparently, Seo-jun said, and kissed her, slow and certain. Right there in the garden built from a feud, married to a woman he'd hated on principle 6 months ago and now couldn't imagine his life without. Somewhere behind them, Odessa raised a glass. To the ugliest alley in the city, she called out, and the two fools who finally made something beautiful out of it. The whole garden raised their glasses in answer, and Talia, laughing against her husband's shoulder, thought that some legacies really were worth fighting for. Not the property, not the restaurants, not even the reversion clause that had started it all. Just this. Just them. Just a Sunday morning kind of love, built slowly, stubbornly, out of coffee and doenjang jjigae and two families who'd finally learned how to share a wall instead of fighting over it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, leave us a comment. Also like, share and subscribe to our channel, and click on the notification bell to get notified whenever a new story is made.